Well, it's a pleasure to be talking today with Per Bauhn. We will be discussing his forthcoming Suffering, Human Rights, and the Virtue of Justice. Per is one of the writing and philosophy of Alan Gewirth and taught for many years at the University of Kalmar. Very happy to be talking with you, Per. Is in your book, you want to outline a moral argument. It is wrong to expose non-human animals to unnecessary suffering, whether in factory farming or in laboratory experiments. At the same time, that non-human animals have moral rights. Can you explain how your
many philosophers working in animal ethics assume that non-human animals have moral rights that are, if not identical, at least similar to human rights. However, it turns out that the best justifying reasons for human rights cannot be extended to the case of non-human animals. According to what I believe to be the most sophisticated philosophical theory of human rights, developed by the Chicago philosopher Alan Gewirth, a holder of human rights must be an agent, that is, someone who controls her behavior in accordance with her unforced choice with the purpose of successfully realizing her goals of action. Such an agent cannot, without contradicting the purposive nature of her action, accept that other agents prevent her from having the freedom and well-being that are the generically necessary conditions of successful action. Consequently, according to Gewirth's theory, all agents must claim rights to freedom and well-being. Now, non-human animals differ from human agents in that they are to a much larger extent controlled by their instincts. They tend to repeat the same behavior over generations, and we see nothing of the dynamic development characteristic of humans. Non-human animals lack the voluntaristic control of their behavior that is typical of agents. So for this reason alone, it would be impossible to extend the concept of agency to them. Another important reason why non-human animals cannot have moral rights is that they are not capable of universalizing any right claim. To claim a moral right for oneself involves more than just expressing an interest in having certain of one's needs or desires satisfied. It also involves recognizing that anyone relevantly similar to oneself should also be entitled to have her needs and desires satisfied. Accordingly, claiming moral rights for oneself comes with a recognition that one also has moral duties regarding other agents' similar rights. Non-human animals would not recognize any such moral duties. The wolf would certainly try to resist being killed, but would just as certainly not hesitate to kill the sheep. Nor would the sheep expect the wolf to recognize any duty not to kill her on behalf of the wolf. Concepts of moral rights and duties simply do not apply to the behavior of non-human animals. They live by their instincts, not by moral principles. This is just how things are. The order of nature is amoral, and in this respect very different from the moral order of human agency.
I have a second, a defender of animal rights might object to that it arbitrarily gives human beings a monopoly on moral rights. Not all humans qualify as purposive agents in the sense you have indicated, for instance, small children and people suffering from various kinds of mental illness be no more agents than some animals. What do you say to this?
Well, first, as the question implies, some humans are not agents in the fullest sense of the term. However, statistically normal adult human beings are agents in this sense. When we are looking for relevant similarities and dissimilarities between humans and non-human animals for the purpose of making moral distinctions, we should look for the rule, not the exception, the standard condition, not the unusual case. Second, we should also remind ourselves that the unusual exceptions among humans can be explained in a way that does not apply to non-human animals. Children will grow up and become agents in the fullest sense of the word. People suffering from incapacitating mental illnesses might recover, and even if they happen to be permanently incapacitated, this is due to unfortunate accidents, not part of the standard conditions of a human life. Humans may lack capacity for agency in the fullest sense by accident. Non-human animals, however, lack this capacity by nature. Third, in the case of humans lacking capacity for agency, we also find a corresponding restriction of their rights. Children and persons suffering from various psychiatric illnesses will have their right to freedom limited in different ways, depending on their varying abilities to control their behavior. Hence, there is no arbitrary discrimination going on here. Not only non-human animals, but also humans will have their rights related to their capacity for agency.
So how is it then, go through a way in which you would defend non-human animals from and torture?
Now, I was not following you there because there was some interruption of the sound. Could you please repeat?
If you could go through how animals can be protected under your...
Yes, that is where I bring in the virtue of justice instead. The virtue of justice is related to the argument I previously have given about moral rights, the Deweythian arguments. First of all, I'm certainly not denying that someone who is cruel to an animal is doing something morally wrong. However, what I want to add is that the reason why it is wrong to be cruel to animals is not that animals have moral rights, but that humans have a duty never to be cruel, a duty that is derived from this virtue of justice that I'm talking about. As rational agents, we have a duty to respect the rights to freedom and well-being of our recipients, that is, the people who are affected by what we do or refrain from doing. In order for us to fulfill this duty, we also have a secondary duty to develop and cultivate in ourselves a disposition to recognize other human beings as holders of rights to freedom and well-being and to treat them in accordance with these rights. To have such a disposition is to have the virtue of justice. Now, for an agent to possess the virtue of justice includes that she refrains from exposing any sentient being, whether human or non-human, to acts of cruelty. Why, one might wonder? Yes, because cruelty implies the deliberate infliction of unnecessary pain and suffering. That the suffering in question is unnecessary means that its infliction is not guided by any idea of causal or moral necessity, but only by the purpose of harming its recipient. Accordingly, a cruel agent does not care for distinctions such as those between guilt and innocence or between deserved and undeserved punishment. Hence, a cruel agent cannot possess the virtue of justice, and as all agents have a duty to develop in themselves that virtue, all agents must also refrain from all acts of cruelty. Now, non-human animals are innocent in the sense that moral concepts of right and wrong cannot be applied to them. Accordingly, to expose an animal to cruelty is to harm an innocent being. Hence, the virtue of justice would require of us that we never expose animals to acts of cruelty. Accordingly, the fact that non-human animals do not have moral rights will not make it morally permissible to treat them badly. What I see as the great advantage of my approach here is that we do not need to make complicated and unrealistic assumptions regarding non-human animals as holders of moral rights, in order to protect them from abuse at the hands of human agents. To extend the idea of moral rights to non-human animals would imply either that we ascribe to animals capacities for agency and universalization that they clearly do not have, or that we disconnect moral rights from the rational justification in the conditions of human agency. And as a result of disconnecting rights from the rational justification, we would be left with a subjectivist approach, according to which talk of moral rights would merely express the speaker's emotion of concern regarding some living organism that she might want to protect. Neither animals nor the idea of moral rights will benefit from such a development. If the idea of moral rights were to be seen as the mere expression of subjective emotional concern, it would lose an important part of its compelling moral power. Not only would the concept of moral rights be less useful to those who want to employ it in the service of animal welfare, but more importantly, its capacity to protect the vital interest of human agents will be seriously undermined. To preserve the moral power of the idea of human rights, we should avoid extending that idea to areas where it does not belong. In this way, I believe my book will make a contribution both to human rights and to animal welfare by pointing to a way in which abuse of animals can be seen as morally wrong without assuming the existence of animal rights.
Yes. Do you have a few examples where we could make some real difference?
Well, I think that the cases where I think most of the abuse of animals take place is, on the one hand, in the production of meat for consumption, factory farming, for instance. And there, I think one has to operate by means of law to regulate the keeping of animals in accordance with animals' welfare, and to make animal welfare a more decisive factor in discussing how agriculture should be for the future. Another area where we also have a lot of concern about animal well-being concerns laboratory testing for various purposes. And there I think, keeping in mind that we still have the idea of human rights here, one has to distinguish between testing and laboratory experiment that are indeed necessary in order to provide, for instance, medication for fatally ill patients or for chronically suffering human patients. That is one thing. But there is also a lot of, one would say, from a human rights perspective, unnecessary experimentation going on relating to rather more superficial purposes. It's like for cosmetic purposes, developing shampoos and deodorants and things like that. And these are of course valuable in their own right, but they are hardly they can hardly motivate animal suffering. They cannot justify animal suffering by reference to human rights. They are not of that dignity.
Mm-hmm. To be unjust, must a person have a intention to be unjust?
At least to be blameworthy for the injustice. I would say that must be intention, or at least to be morally blameworthy, because I think one can be blamed in different senses. One can be blamed for being cruel and insensitive, but one can also be blamed for lacking the relevant kind of knowledge. For instance, if one is dealing with animal without understanding the needs of animal, one can, without being a sadistic or a cruel person, still cause a lot of suffering simply by not being knowledgeable enough to deal with animals. And then I think that the blame would be that a blame of incompetence, that one is actually dealing with things that one is not cognitively fit to deal with because one doesn't have the relevant knowledge. And that would be a different blame from the moral blame of being sadistic or cruel to animals.
And is there a difference between causing actual pain through poking or so forth, and moving an animal away from its habitat?
Yeah, that brings in further aspects of this discussion, because when you are removing an animal from the habitat, sometimes that can be done in order to protect animals. If for some reason animals are endangered when they are in their natural habitat, then it can be part of animal conservation to actually move them, although that move, of course, can bring with it pain too to an animal who is very much habituated to be in a certain kind of environment. But the long-term perspective can still be that one actually save members of a species by moving them. So it's also a matter of for what reason one is doing that move. That has to be considered too.
And maybe a final question I want to ask you is on eugenics for animals. Does this fit into justice?
Well, it might depend on how that eugenics is intended to take place. One can, of course, think of if one could make certain animals less dangerous, but by some kind of genetic modification. So for instance, certain kinds of vipers would lose their venom, that they will no longer be harmful to human beings. And in that sense, one could say there are no longer any reason for human beings to try to kill them. Then that might be a positive kind of eugenics from the point of view of preserving the animal. On the other hand, if the same kind of intervention also makes it less possible or makes it more difficult for that animal to survive in its natural environment, because now it doesn't have the capacity to hunt. It cannot, for instance, paralyze its prey and can't eat it and so on. Then, of course, we have a negative effect on it. I think eugenics in general should one should be very careful before one enters into that, because as with many of these kind of rather thoroughgoing kinds of interventions, scientific interventions, they often tend to have consequences that are not really predictable, or that they can be of a very mixed character. So one should be careful with this kind of interventions. Just as I believe that there has been talk about preventing climate change by, for instance, creating artificial kind of clouds that will prevent the sun rays from getting through to the earth. I think one should be very careful with that kind of intervention, because one is looking at only one thing that one wants to prevent, global warming. One doesn't think about what will happen to agricultural climate and what kind of starvation might be the effects of people not being able to harvest, for instance, for 2 years if there is this kind of absence of sufficient warming. In the 19th centuries, we had this kind of effects. And in those days that there were no capacities to store food for longer times, which meant that after 2 bad harvests, people started to starve and they died. So I think one should be careful before one starts to mess around with the natural conditions of life, whether animal or human.
A precautionary reason, yes.
Yes.
And the last aspect of the eugenics question, what if you made duck livers much bigger so they could have more pate? But the ducks don't like it. The ducks sometimes fall down with their big livers.
Yes. I think that there must be clear limits to how much one does to satisfy the tastes of culinary advanced people. I mean, we had cases like this some 10, 15 years ago. There was a talk of what they call the Belgian blue. these were cattle that were artificially modified, genetically modified in such a way that they were incapable of moving. They were just actually standing there, eating and swallowing and getting bigger, and until it was time to slaughter them. They didn't have anything that could be considered a life in any ordinary meaning of it. And I think that these are repelling things to do. As I say, I don't believe in animal rights, but I still believe that there are certain things that are certainly abominable that is done to animals, and this would be one of them. So no, I believe we should leave the ducks as they are in that sense.
Well, thank you for a very fascinating discussion. Your book should be at the top of everyone's fingers to go into all these interesting questions. It's certainly always a pleasure to talk with you, and thank you so much for the conversation.
Thank you for having me, Michael. Thank you.
Bye-bye.